Hi there, I'm Michael. I hope you're having a great day. Last week I took part in the Brackeys 2025.1 Game Jam and made a recording each day of my progress. This video is the result of that. I go over everything I did to create this game in the 7-day period of the jam, using Unity, Blender, and my wife's drawing skills for 2D references and sprites. Before we get started, if you like game dev content, then please consider subscribing and get a glass of water because this is a long one. Alright, the game jam is going to be starting in 10 seconds. Three, two, one. Oh, I need to refresh the page. Alright, there we go. Now I need to find the theme, scroll down. Nothing can go wrong. Which means I can make a game about... So naturally, I didn't have any ideas to start with, so I grabbed my notebook and I started a mind map, going over what I could do with the theme of nothing can go wrong. I was writing stuff down, like what you can get from saying nothing can go wrong, like you could say it in a sarcastic way, or you could say it in a serious way. I couldn't get my mind off the idea of making a puzzle game, and also the idea of precarious objects came up into my mind. Fortunately, my wife, who's working on the 2D art that I need for this, came in and gave me some of her ideas.
Like the game where you've got plumbing, right? You put down the tubes and then the water pours in and suddenly you find out, oh, I didn't do the right thing over there, now it's all pouring out.
What, like the Bioshock minigame? Where you have to do the tubes, but like more to it.
Yeah.
After we finished sharing our ideas, I carried on with my notes in my notebook. From the idea of the minigame found in Bioshock, I started to think about somebody following a path home. Then I was thinking, what if your character is making sure that nothing goes wrong? I think I may have something. I then started working on the game design document. I had headers for concept, gameplay, storyline, characters, art style, levels, audio, UI and controls. The idea that I'm going for is that you play as a dog whose owner has just come out blissfully unaware of all these hazards that are around him, and it's your job to make sure that he gets home safe. I'm hoping that I can make the game complex enough that it is actually enjoyable. I decided I'm going to go for a low poly style because it's what I know how to make, and that the mechanics that we would have in the game are simple WASD movement, interactable objects, a moving NPC in the form of our owner who is walking home, and dog catchers that come later in the game. Hoping to create 5 levels for this, and once the game design document was ready, I showed it to my wife. She started drawing the 2D references that I'll need to create the 3D dog model, and I got to work with creating a new project in Unity and getting started. The first thing I wanted to do was create a player model, so I created this little world. Put down a plane to put a capsule on. That'll be a placeholder until I get the model made. I started working on the code using a rigid body and putting forces onto the rigid body to move it around. And then I had to add in rotation so that the object was actually rotating. I put a small object on the front of it so I could actually see if we were rotating, and made it a bit smaller to represent the dog model a bit better. I installed Cinemachine, which is a package for Unity you can download from the package manager, and it just adds a bunch of extra features to the camera. I spent ages working on this virtual camera to then write a script to create an orbiting camera using the mouse, but then I found out that the FynestLyk camera actually has all the stuff I want to do already programmed in it, and it just requires a little bit of settings changing. My next task was getting the owner to follow a path. For this I would use waypoints in the form of empty objects in an array and have the owner go straight towards a waypoint. After I did that, I built out a skeleton of what I want the first level to be, and then I put waypoints accordingly because I wanted to see how it looks when he goes down that gap there, because later I want to put stairs in that gap. So I didn't have to keep looking at these white meshes. I put new materials over them, a green for the floor and then a grey to be where the path is, just so I can see it without having to kind of figure it out by going through all my waypoints. I placed a big object that would become an interactable object later on. I sorted out the rotation on the owner, so he's rotating towards the points that he's walking to. After that, I started programming the player interact, which I just set up to be a simple E key press. Once the player presses E, it would create a collider around them and then check everything in there, get the closest object that's interactable, then run the interactable code. I then created a script called interactable, stuck it on the object I wanted to delete, and just gave it a simple bit of code that would just turn off the object. I then added in the rest of the code for the trying to interact, which would allow it to check and find which object it needed to interact with. Finally added in a kind of win and loss condition. If the owner touches the hazard, which is this big white log here, then it comes up in the console with "you lose." Whereas if he touches this big circle on the floor here, it would come up with "you win." And that is where I'm standing after the first day of the game jam. We can also go have a look at my wife's art and see how the player character is coming along. And on to day 2. I decided I was going to work on some modelling today. I started off by taking photos of my wife's drawings and importing them into Blender, lining them up, creating a cube and creating the head to begin with. Using a mirror modifier, I only had to create one side of it. Then I moved on to the body and made a new cylinder and cut it in half, filled in the faces on each end and then started positioning it in place. Added a couple of loop cuts and started positioning them according to my reference, and added more loop cuts that I would then later extrude to create the legs. To create the shouldery kind of area, I would grab the vertices above where I'd extrude the leg and I'd just drag them out. I was only going for a low poly style, so I don't need to put a lot of detail into this. With the paws, I just duplicated the front paws and moved them onto the back and then bridged the edge loops. And the last thing I had to model was the tail. After that, it was time to UV unwrap, which I'm not very good at. I haven't done UV unwrapping very much. It kind of confuses me where I have to mark the seams and whatnot. You can let me know if I did a good job or not. After I finished marking the seams on the model and unwrapping it, I went around and grouped all the different parts together and then packed them all together onto one texture file. You have to let me know in the comments if this is correct. I'm still learning with UVs and I think this looks very messy, so it's probably not correct. Once the UVs were done, I started painting the dog. Decided I'd make the dog a grey and use a darker grey for the parts of the body that would always be in shadow no matter what, because I don't know what I'm going to be doing with the shaders in Unity. I might want to have some kind of toon shading, or I might just leave it with its default shading. To paint the eyes, I hid the hair that was covering the eyebrows with H, went in, painted them in and then used Alt-H to unhide, and I think it turned out pretty nice looking. Then using the Rigify plugin, I added a animal wolf. Looking back at it now, I should have just used the basic Rigify quadruped. I do not need all those bones up in the face area, but I guess it's better to have them and not need them than to need them and not have them. When it came to parenting the mesh to the rig, for some reason it just wasn't working, and I thought it was a problem with the weight painting. Like something had gone wrong and I'd have to manually weight paint the whole thing, which would have been a problem because I've never done weight painting before. Turns out the problem that was stopping the mesh from moving was a vertice on top of another vertice, and it took me far too long to realize that. You can select your entire mesh in edit mode, press M to merge, and then do by distance, and any vertices that are on top of each other will be merged. This might fix your problem if your mesh isn't moving with the rig when you parent it. After that, I worked on animations. On my second monitor, I had a reference sheet with just pictures of how dogs run. I was watching some videos on how dogs run, trying to get all those key poses. I didn't really have time to make super detailed, so I was just keying out all the major poses. If I have more time later, then I may go back and add more detail to these animations. I only made 2 of the animations I need to make, an idle animation and a running animation. At the very least, I also want an animation for barking and headbutting. This was the running animation that I came up with, and I think it doesn't look too bad. I exported the textures with the model into Unity and set up the player model to be using the mesh instead of a capsule. I then set up all the animations and wrote some code to detect when our mesh is moving and then play the running animation when we're moving, which again, if I have time later on, I'll come back, add more detail to this. I'm just trying to make a bare bones version at the moment. I was planning to do more programming today. Creating the player model took most of the time out of my day. By the time I was finished, the time had just blown away. So I decided to create a few more models to end off the day. An axe model, a log model, a tree model, a stump model, a tree that is ready to be cut down, a hole, and some bushes that I'm going to use as a boundary. I then imported all of this stuff into Unity. I also tried to be quite economic with my textures because I'm reusing a lot of the brown and the green. Things like the bushes use the green texture from the trees with a little bit of red in the corner of the texture to be used for the berries on the bushes. So today was mostly just modeling. Tomorrow I'll start day 3 off with getting rid of any of the faces that can't be seen on any of these models, because I was running out of time today, I just kind of slapped those spheres together, and I need to remove those faces if you can't see them because that's just a waste of processing power. And I can start programming in some of the interactions I want to have, like I want the dog to be able to pick up the axe in its mouth and then chop down the tree and push the log into the hole. Hopefully that all goes according to plan. See you tomorrow. Started the day off in Blender, getting rid of all those faces that can't be seen. To do that, I would just box select all of the visible faces and then go to select invert, shift click any faces that were selected that I didn't want to delete, and then delete faces. Once I re-imported all the meshes, I added colliders to them all, and I added a rigid body to the log so I could push it into this hole here. I had to use multiple box colliders on this hole to get the right shape of collider for it, and then I had an additional collider inside which I set to a trigger. So when the log goes into it, it would snap into place. And then I just had to readjust the log so that when it would snap into place, it would snap actually in place inside of the hole. I then took the interact class that we had originally and I made it into an abstract class, which would then be inherited by axe, so that I could then inherit the method of interact down into everything that I want to interact with. First interactable that I was creating was an axe that would be snapped into the player's mouth. In order to inherit from the abstract class, all you do is put the word interactable, or the name of your abstract class, at the top of the class where monobehavior is. You then have to provide a public override for all the methods that are listed in your abstract class. The reason I do this, when I press E and look for an interactable object, it will see that the axe has inherited from interactable and thus is an interactable object, and will then run the specific interact code that I have put into the axe script, which in this case was just to snap the axe into the dog's mouth. I had to do a little bit of correcting, but this is what it looked like. I did try to child it to the head bone in the rig, but I couldn't get it to work and it was taking way too long for such a small detail. I can come back to that. I also then programmed the cuttable tree also as an interactable. When you would interact with it, it would check if you have the axe, and if you are, it would delete the tree model, replace it with a stump and spawn the log. My idea is that the player will then have to push this log into the hole, and that's one of the things the player is going to have to do. I also programmed the hole to have the win-loss thing from day one, where I have an object called hazard area with a trigger collider inside of it. If the owner walks into this collider, then he disappears and it comes up with you lose in the console. But if the player gets the log into the hole, it deletes the hazard zone object and the owner is able to walk over perfectly fine. I then created two new animations for barking and for a headbutt. I want to have a little group of rats on the floor the player has to bark at to get them to move, and I'm thinking I'll use the headbutt as something to break a crate. As my last task for the day, I created a rat model because it was getting very late, which I'll program in tomorrow and hopefully get a skeleton of a level running so I can go ahead and program the levels, add music and start polishing up the game. But that'll be for tomorrow, so see you on day 4. Today I was not as productive as I wanted to be. It appears I have contracted the common cold and my throat is really sore. I wanted to at least get the rat hazard done today, so I started animating the rats in Blender, but then when I imported them into Unity and I tried to get all the animations to play, it was just being a pain. So instead I programmed the movement into the rats. I put an empty object underneath a rats object. The rat mesh would then use to run around in circles. I also made it so the rat would respond to an event called onBark, triggered when the player barks, which causes the rats to run away in the direction opposite to the dog. I also put in a little particle effect for when the player barks, and then made it so the player has to be in range of the rat to make him run. Not a massive amount done today, but hopefully tomorrow is better. Unfortunately, the cold got worse, so I apologise. The rest of this video I may have a nasally nose. Started the day off with making the breakable crate. My idea is to have this crate break and then drop an axe. Shoved it into Unity and started working on the programming for it. I made it so the crate has a serialised field for a prefab that it can drop. In my case, I'm going to have it drop the axe, and then create a public method for it to get destroyed when the player headbutts it. I ended up changing the crate script to a headbuttable script because I may want to add other things that can be destroyed by a headbutt, and this means I wouldn't have to recode it all. On the dog side of things, I put an empty object in front of him, and when the player headbutts, a collider appears around that object, and if there's a headbuttable thing there, it will run its headbuttable code. I did find out from doing this that my code to chop down the trees wouldn't work, because when the axe was being spawned, it was being spawned as axe clone. When the tree chopping down code was running, it was looking for an object called axe. I fixed this by having the code look through all of the player's transforms for an object that is tagged as axe, and then running the code as usual if it finds that tag. My wife then sent me these references for our owner character, so I got to work on modelling him. Made the head, I made the body, gave him a hood for like a hoodie, and then I gave him legs and feet. I then gave him hair by selecting all the faces on his head, duplicating those faces, and then separating them by selection, and growing them with Alt S. And then I did the same thing again on the top of the hair to create the hat. I then went in and did all the painting, and finally rigged him up using Blender's Rigify plugin. I gave him 2 animations, one for a happy walk, and one for when he's at the end of the level and he's waiting for the player. Because I've decided that when he reaches the end, the player will have to go to him in order to trigger the next level. Here is our owner walking into the floor because of the way the waypoints work. I then created a fence which I'll be using for more scenery. I spent some time fixing the camera, making it so instead of zooming in and out when the player moves his mouse up and down, it would zoom in and out when the player used the mouse wheel. To end off the day, I decided I was going to create a main menu, just so that's ready to go. Threw together a bare bones main menu with a start button, an instructions button and a credits button. And the code for the main menu is just using the scene manager to start the game and turning different panels on and off in order to show them on screen. I then had a thought that I should probably test this as a build rather than just testing it in Unity. I've had a few games in the past where they've run perfectly fine in the editor in Unity, and then when I build them on the day, they don't work, but only in the build version. So I built the WebGL version and I stuck it on a private itch page just to make sure that everything was working. I did have to mess around with the resolution settings and the player settings, but I did get it to work and now I don't have to worry about that. I also made the crater hazard because the owner's path being blocked by something is something that has gone wrong. Hopefully tomorrow I do not have this blocked nose and we can get closer and closer to finishing. My wife drew me up a skybox using Critter, ported that into Unity, but I didn't specify to her how a skybox should look, so it ended up with this line going through it, where the edges of the picture are meeting, and this up in the sky, which can be our little secret because the player can't look up anyway. I thought to fix it, I could take it into GIMP and double the image canvas width, copy the image, drag it over and flip it. It made the cloud on the left side into a giant cloud, so I just changed it back to the original unmirrored version. I was then looking for some music software that I would use in the evening to make some music for the game. I normally use FL Studios, but I do not own a license for it, so I went looking for an alternative. I settled on using BandLab and then went out to go do my daily chores. Once I got home, I made the first level. I think I'm going to have to downsize from making 5 levels down to 3 levels, but that's all okay. This first level is to introduce the player to the idea of headbutting the crates, picking up the axe, chopping down the tree and pushing it into the hole. I probably could stretch out to 5 levels if I split the mechanics into their own separate levels and then put them all together for a final level, but we'll have to see how much time I have. I then set up the owner to wave when he gets to the end of the level. I created a game manager which had serialized fields for the owner's animator and 2 panels which I would display on the UI. One for if the player wins with a button that takes him to the next level, and one for if the player loses that lets him retry the level. The reason I store the owner's animator, because we know if the animator goes null, then the object holding it has been destroyed, and if the owner gets destroyed, then the player has lost. And for the win screen, if the animator is in the state where he is waiting, and if the player's position is close to the owner, measured using vector3.distance. I then opened up BandLab and started making some music in it. I started off by creating a rhythm with the chords of G major, D major, E minor and C major. Set the instrument bar at the bottom to be in the key of G major, which would give me these little orange indicators underneath all the notes that would sound alright. And then played a little melody over the top. Then I took the time to go clean that up with the MIDI editor. I've never put music into any of my games. This will be the first time that I'm making music and putting it into my game. And if I'm completely honest, I don't massively know what I'm doing. So it was a lot of trial and error to make something that I thought sounded okay. After that I just put in a bass line which followed just the root of every chord. and I exported it and brought it into Unity. I then created a music manager which is created on the main menu with a script with just don't destroy on load in the start method. This turns it into a singleton. It will be the only one that exists. Ideally you should put a check in any kind of singleton that would then delete any other variant of that object so it does stay as the only one, but I'm just thinking of that now, so I'm going to do that tomorrow. If you find your lights aren't working like this when you load into a scene, you need to open the lighting tab and click generate lighting in the bottom right. That should hopefully fix the lighting issue. And then I ended the day by putting in the invisible walls for the first level and putting a mute music button on the main menu. Tomorrow is Saturday, the deadline is on Sunday. I plan to submit the game tomorrow just to avoid any potential issues on Sunday. So I've got a lot of work ahead of me tomorrow. Let's see what we come up with. Started off today by making that music manager into a true singleton. In the awake method, you just check if there are any other objects that have the tag of music manager, and if there is, then you destroy this one. I then imported a few more images that my wife made, one for the you win and you lose titles, and one for the control scheme. I then took those images, made them into their own separate images like WASD on its own, Q on its own, E on its own, etc. And then imported them into Unity. I set them up as sprites and then placed them as images on the UI. When I started doing this, I thought the main menu looked a bit bland, so I spent some time just building out the main menu, putting down some meshes to make it look a bit more interesting. After that, I finished making the instructions page, putting on the controls and some general instructions. I then wanted to get some audio of a dog barking to use for the bark. I have this old footage of my dog Baby. Took that footage into Audacity, took just the bark from it, extracted it as an MP3 and brought it into Unity. I then put it on the player, which gave the player an audio source, and then whenever the player would bark, it would play the audio source. I added in some floating action to the axe, making it go up and down because it seemed a bit bland just sitting there, and made it so when the player was close enough to an interactable object, either the axe or the cuttable tree, the E key would appear on the screen to indicate that they can do something. If they try to interact with the tree without an axe, they'll get a little warning that says can't cut down the tree without an axe. I then brought in the other two sprites for the win and loss screen and started building out the second level, focused mainly on introducing the player to the rats, and also worked on level 3, which would be a combination of the rats and the pushing the log into the hole. I then decided to say screw it, I'm going to try and fit in one more mechanic, jumped into Blender and created a button with an animation for it pressing down and coming back up, and decided that I'd build out a fourth level and try to get this button to work, making a door open and close. For the door I just used the fence model, and because I don't have much time I was just slapping together what code I could to get it to run. When the player walks on the button, or if a log is on the button, it will play the animation for the button compressing through a trigger zone, which then tells a fence to open and close. This code is really badly coupled together with the fence. I wouldn't be able to use this button for anything else, but I'm just throwing it together because I want this extra mechanic in there before I submit it. And put a hazard on the door when it's closed that gets turned off when it's open, so if the owner walks into the door it counts as a loss. And finally, building level 5, which has all the mechanics in there, 3 cuttable trees, a rat, some boxes, and 2 holes to be filled. There's also a button that the player would have to put a log on top of so that the player can actually reach the end of the level. I fixed a little bug with the music where the ending was weirdly looping because it cut off strangely, and then uploaded a test build for myself and my wife to play through and see if we could find any bugs. We did find a few, and I fixed them quite promptly. Things like on the windscreen the game time wasn't stopping. On the 3rd level, the waypoint didn't reach the finish line, so the player couldn't finish the level, and the gate having 2 hazards on it, so the owner was getting destroyed regardless if it was open or closed, among many more. I also made it so if you press the R key, it will reset the level. All that's left to do now is take some screenshots. I'm submitting with about 8.5 hours left, but that's because it is currently 3:30 in the morning, and I don't want to risk waking up at say 9, 10, and then finding out that my internet is dead or something and I can't submit. So, the game is now submitted. I'm going to go to bed. And that is how I built my game jam submission. Over the next 2 weeks, I'll be playing other people's submissions and giving feedback, and I hope they in turn do the same for me. Personally, I think I could have done better. If I hadn't gotten sick, and if I planned out my mechanics a bit better, I could have avoided quite a bit of stress. But I am happy with what I ended up creating, and the things I learnt will be taken forward in my future games and jams that I participate in. If you are here at this point in the video, thank you very much for watching. I know this is the longest video I've made by far, but if you could subscribe and like the video, it would be greatly appreciated. And leave a comment letting me know your thoughts. Did you take part in the game jam? How was your experience or your team's experience? That's it. That's the end of the video. Thank you for watching. I hope you have a great day.